topic for today is learning. You can say learning psychology or learning. So learning, for you to master this chapter, you need to know that learning is divided into 4 units. That is the concepts of learning, associative learning, cognitive learning, as well as social learning. It's divided into 4 units. As your study unit will say, let's open the study unit before we continue any further. So as always, before you even comment, you need to know what is learning. What comes into your mind when you talk about learning? What comes into your mind when you talk about the concept learning? The concept of learning, what is your understanding of the term learning? So we all have a general idea of what learning is. We all have a general idea of what learning is, even though we may find it difficult to define. So learning is formally defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience. So this is how to define learning. Learning is formally defined as a relative permanent change in behavior. For instance, now I'm conducting the class with you. I'm sharing knowledge. So for us to determine whether learning took place, you need to be able to understand. You need to be able to put things into practice. That is learning. I teach you how to ride a bike. That is a process of learning. However, the actual learning is whereby you can ride a bike yourself. You say that is learning. They say learning is formally defined as a relatively permanent change in one's behavior due to experience. So as soon as you are able to do something that you have been taught, that is learning. If there's no change in behavior, if you are not teachable, we don't call it learning, because learning, you need to be able to adapt to what you are being taught. This implies that we can see that learning has taken place when there is a change in behavior. Now they are giving us an example. They're saying, look at the following example. Nomsa submitted her first assignment late. Nomsa submitted her first assignment late. Therefore, it was not marked. When you submit assignment late, chances are that it won't be marked. Depends on the lecturer. However, when the closing date has passed, but the assignment portal is open, they can accept it so that you get an examination entry. However, no marks will be awarded. So this is what it implies here. They say Nomsa submitted their assignment late, and therefore it was not marked. After that, Nomsa made sure that all her assignments were submitted before the closing date so that they will be marked. She will receive the credit needed for admission to the exam. Let's start afresh. This is Nomsa submitted the assignment late, therefore it was not marked. It was returned unmarked with 0. After that, Nomsa made sure that all her other assignments were submitted before closing day so that they would be marked. She will receive the credit she needed for admission to an exam. They say Nomsa learned that late assignment submission do not get marked. Therefore, change her behaviors. So she submitted all her assignments before the closing date. That is relatively permanent change in behavior. So Nomsa learned that when you submit your assignment late, you won't get awarded for that assignment. Meaning there's a learning there, because she learns that when you submit late, your assignment won't get marked. She changed her behavior by submitting the assignment early. You see, that is a process of learning. That's why they will tell you, let's say they are reprimanding you not to do something. They're telling you, don't do this. That's not okay. But you continue doing it, then you get into trouble. There's that sarcastic say, they'll say, you have learned, at least you have learned your lesson. You learn, at least you have learned the lesson, meaning there was a consequence in what you did. So the consequence equals to what? Learned behavior. But if there's no consequence, they won't say you have learned. Instead, they'll say you learn. So that is learning. Learning has to do with the change in behavior. Let's continue. So for us to master the concept of learning is in different phases. Learning is in different phases. We have associative learning, cognitive learning, as well as social learning. Learning is a concept on its own. However, it can be broken down into 4 aspects. That is associative learning, cognitive learning, social learning. Let's go to associative learning. By associative learning, we mean you learn by association. Let's break down the concept first. We learn by association. By relating, in short, by relating concepts. Let's say, for instance, when you hear a whistle, meaning it's an indication that someone is calling either a dog or another person. That's an association. Hence, when someone whistles while you're walking on the street, chances are you'll turn and look around if that's your type of communication. You are driving, then you hear what? A hooter. Beep. It's an association. You are driving, someone indicates the bright light towards you as an indication. It's a communication signal. That is association. You learn by associating certain things. If someone frowns, you'll assume that either she's upset or uncomfortable. If someone smiles, automatically we assume that he or she is happy. We associate. That is association, associative learning. Like I always say, once you open a textbook, you see a concept like associative learning, don't go further studying without defining the name. You need to be able to define the term first in your own understanding. You break it down your own understanding. You might find that even though you have broken down the name, the concept, it differs from the textbook content. Remember, there are no wrong or right answers in that case. Meaning, you have learned that this is a true definition. This is a incorrect definition. It's not a waste of time exercise. Okay, associative learning. Associative learning, we have classical conditioning. Classical conditioning refers to the type of learning that takes place when a response usually stimulated by one stimulus is then associated with a different stimulus. Let me continue and read it slow. Classical conditioning refers to the type of learning that takes place when a response usually stimulated by one stimulus is then associated with a different stimulus that normally would not lead to that response. Let me break it down for you. Refer to the type of learning. We know what learning is. Learning, if something triggers you, there's a change of behavior. It takes place when there's a change of behavior. That takes place when a response usually stimulated by one response is then associated with different stimulus. I whistle while you are walking on the street. I whistle or shout. That is stimulus. My shouting or calling your name. That is what is a form of a stimulus. The voice is a stimulus, the sound is a stimulus. Then what you do, you turn and look at me. Whether through excitement or through anger. So that is what? That is stimulus number one. They say refer to the type of learning that takes place when a response is usually stimulated by one stimulus. So one stimulus is a whistle or shout to name. Is then associated to the different stimulus. Your different stimulus is your response. I call your name. That's the first stimulus, my voice sound. A different stimulus when you respond or retaliate. You look at me, you shout back, or you indicate that you can hear my voice. That is the what? A different stimulus that normally would not lead to that response. So that it's autonomic, it's automatical. When someone shouts, you turn. That's how the mind works. But for us to understand this, they break it down into 4 types of conditions. We have unconditional stimulus, unconditional response, a conditioned stimulus, and a conditioned response. But before we go, we move further. They say classical conditioning. At times, it happens that when you study, you find it difficult to grasp certain concepts. You find it difficult to memorize certain concepts. And remember, this module is multiple choice questions. Multiple choice question is tricky because when you set a paper, when the lecturer set your paper, the examiners, they look at few words. You need to determine they measure your intelligence by breaking down sentences, by using few words to determine how attentive you are. How do you study? For instance, classical conditions refer to the type of learning that takes place when a response usually stimulated by another stimulus is then associated with different stimulus that normally would not lead to a response. You see, one, you need to highlight one stimulus. When you study, make sure that you understand when they say one stimulus. After one stimulus is associated with a different stimulus. One stimulus associated with another a different stimulus, but normally would not lead to a response. So that's a key in defining classical condition. Is whereby one stimulus is associated with different stimulus, but will not lead to that response. So that's a key. You need to highlight this. That's where the answer is. One stimulus is associated with different stimulus, but would not lead to a response. That's the classical condition. Figure 1.1. The unconditional stimulus is a stimulus that causes the subject to respond in a specific way before any learning has taken place. An unconditional response to an unconditional stimulus. A conditioned stimulus, I'll make an example to make this much easier for you. A conditioned stimulus, a stimulus that initially is neutral, but no association paired with unconditional stimulus. It may produce a desired response when presented without an unconditional stimulus. For example, a bell is a conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus, the response that follows the conditioned stimulus. Let's use an example for you to understand this. Let's start from here. They say an unconditional stimulus. An unconditional stimulus is a stimulus that causes the subject to respond in a specific way before any learning takes place. They like using a dog in this scenario. Imagine a dog and an owner. A dog and an owner as an owner, it is your duty to feed the dog. Now, when again you feed the dog, in a specific time, mostly in one setting, in one place. What you do, it depends. At times you whistle, you call the dog name Rocky, or you go out, take the dish. As soon as you pick up the dish, the dog will know that food is coming. As soon as you open a certain cupboard, the dog will notice that food is coming, because that's where they place the food. So what is the unconditional stimulus? An unconditional stimulus is stimulus that causes the object to respond in a specific way before any length takes place. So when you whistle, here you are about to feed a dog, you go outside, you whistle. If not whistle, you open a certain cupboard. Animals learn by association. They can differentiate when you open your butler, the sounds. When you open your cupboard, when you open your car, they can associate. So they know that normally when you open this cupboard, food is coming. So that is what? An unconditioned stimulus. You whistling, walking towards the dog, opening that cupboard, that is an unconditional stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, which is the stimulus that causes the subject. The subject here is the what? A dog. To respond in a specific way before any learning takes place. As soon as the dog hears that whistle, as soon as the dog hears that cupboard that carries food, the dog does what? Gets excited. The dog gets excited. Yes, they say it's an unconditional stimulus, because that doesn't mean that the dog will get food, but they learn by association. They learn by association. That sound, that cupboard, when you carry the food, perhaps in the plastic, they know that that's the sound of that package, that there must be food there. It's an unconditional stimulus. An unconditional stimulus, the stimulus that causes the subject, which is the dog, to respond in a specific way before any learning takes place. Before any learning takes place, they know that food is coming, they get excited. Then what is an unconditional response? An unconditional response, the response to an unconditional stimulus, conditional response. Now, what is an unconditional response? The unconditional response comes from where? Comes from the subject. That is the dog. They hear the footsteps, the sound of the package, or the whistling. That is unconditional stimulus. Then unconditional response is what? Normally they wait. They salivate because of that excitement. They blink their tail, they salivate, meaning that's an unconditional response. It's something that the dog cannot control, because they hear the smell of the food, the sound, they know that they are about to eat now. Then the what? Unconditional response, they salivate through excitement, saliva. The response is an unconditional response, which is salivation from the dog. They said the response to an unconditional stimulus is influenced by what? Is influenced by this unconditional stimulus. That food is coming. Then, point 3, a conditioned stimulus, a stimulus that initially is neutral, but no association with unconditional stimulus. It may produce a desired response when presented without unconditional stimulus. For example, a bell is a conditioned stimulus. So in this case, yes, a conditional stimulus will be, let's assume that instead of whistling, you use a bell. You hit a bell, king. That is what? A conditional stimulus, because you do it purposefully. You ring a bell, you do it purposefully. So each and every time when you're about to feed the dogs, you ring a bell. automatically the dogs will know that food is coming. That is a form of a conditioned stimulus. Because you're doing it purposefully, let's continue. A conditioned stimulus, a stimulus that initially is neutral. They are used that when you ring a bell, food is coming. But association with unconditional stimulus. The conditioned stimulus, the one that you done purposefully, links with unconditional stimulus. Remember, unconditional stimulus, they hear your footsteps. You open a certain cupboard. You carry food. Food has a sound and smell. It's unconditional stimulus. You associate the two. Conditioned is a bell. You do it purposefully. Unconditionally, normally you don't do it purposefully. The dog have learned to associate the sounds, the footsteps, the smell, that food is coming. Then unconditional response, they respond by salivating mostly. Okay, it may produce a desired response when presented without unconditional stimulus, for example, a bell. I hope you're clear. Then the last one, a conditioned response, the response that follows conditioned response. Before we continue here, let me take your questions so that I don't confuse you further. Let me take your questions. I want to hear your voices. How many students are we having? We have 10 students. Before we continue, any question regarding the classical conditions? Any questions regarding classical conditions? Remember, this is our class, not says one class. So feel free to voice your opinion, to discuss. At times you may feel that say explain classical condition, but I feel like he can explain it in this way. Feel free to do that. For more clarity. So far, I've explained the concept learning. Then we went straight to what? Classical condition. And it's 4 aspects. Unconditional stimulus, conditioned stimulus, unconditional response, and conditioned response. We have 10 students here. So each time we explain this concept like learning, they normally use animals. So same applies to you. You can use dogs. They give a new example related to dog and then owner. So use those examples. Okay, guys, if you do understand, you want me to continue? You know the icon on top of your chart. The emojis, the one with emojis, that indicates that say you can continue. Okay, I don't see any hands. Let me continue. Okay, guys, can you hear me? Maybe it's a network. You can hear me. Can you hear me? Kabetsu, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me continue. Thanks very much, Mashaba. Okay, let's continue, guys. Moving on. The principles of classical conditions. The principles of classical conditions. We have what? Reinforcement, extension, speedy recovery, high order conditioning, stimulus generalization as well as stimulus discrimination. Besides these points, there are the conditions and conditional. There are principles within it. But I think I didn't explain something. When we say something, you are conditioned to something. We explain associative and say it's a concept that you can use to relate. As learned by association, relating a subject and object, or relating a stimulus and your response. That is an association. When you're conditioned to something, meaning you are used to something. I'm conditioned to this, I'm used to something. It's normal, I'm conditioned to it. So that's the term. So principles of classical conditioning, number one, reinforcement means strengthening the likelihood of a response, strengthening the likelihood of the response. Again, we use a dog as an example. They say when you reinforce something, even if you don't use a dog, you use kids. Your kid goes to school, gets high marks, the teacher put a star. By putting the star on, or by just writing very good, let's append for Samantha. Very good. Meaning the teacher is doing what? Is reinforcing the good behavior, is reinforcing that Samantha needs to make sure that always gets good results. That is reinforcement. Reinforcement means strengthening the likelihood of a response. You are the learner in order to continue producing that acceptable behavior, that good behavior. In relation to the dogs, we can say each and every time when you ring the bell or when you whistle, and the whistle and the bell automatically comes with food, the dog gets used to it. That when the bell rings, I'll get food. That is, you reinforced the behavior. Reinforcement means strengthening the likelihood of the response. The bell rings automatically, the owner brings the food. The dog gets used to it. That is what is reinforcement. Because there is a likelihood that something will happen. Reinforcement means strengthening the likelihood of a response. Then we have what? Extension. Extension is the disappearance of the previous learned response. The disappearance of the previous learned response. The response disappears. Unlike reinforcement is likely to happen. Extension, the response disappears. Let's make an example here. A dog owner decides to take a vacation. The owner of the dog decides to take a vacation. Then they call Sarah. They call Sarah to come and stay in the house and make sure that Sarah takes care of the dogs. Normally the dog eats when 7 o'clock in the morning. Animals, again, they can associate, they can measure time in their head. That normally when their taxis beep beep outside the street, people are talking, meaning chances of food will come. It's around 7 o'clock. They learn by association. They call Sarah. Sarah comes to the house. 7 o'clock, Sarah does not dish food. Or what happens is that Sarah dish food without even ringing the bell. Sarah does dish food for the dogs, but however, does not ring the bell. The dogs are used to the bell. The dogs are used to that the owner will walk using that direction, front gate, to give them food. But Sarah decides to bring food from the back. So what will happen to the dog response? They say the extinction is a disappearance of the previous learned response. Dogs have learned that before the dish, before food comes, the bell will ring. Before food comes, the owner uses the front gate. But suddenly, Sarah changes things around. Doesn't whistle, bring the food. Doesn't bell the ring, bring the food, use a different gate. Meaning the response changes. Yes, they say extinction is the disappearance of the previously learned response. I hope I'm clear. Then we move to speedy recovery. Speedy recovery is the reappearance of a response which seems to have been switched off. The reappearance of the response which has disappeared. Remember, strengthening the likelihood they are used to this, they have learned the disappearance changes. They learn new ways of doing things. The previous learned response disappears. And the speedy recovery, let's assume that the owner comes back after 2 weeks. The owner does the things, feed the dog the way he or she used to. 7 o'clock, he rings the bells, then brings food. Then the dogs again, they need to readjust. They need to readjust to the bell. That is what we call that speedy recovery. Speedy recovery is a reappearance of the response which seems to have been switched off. It has been switched off because they changed the owner. Sarah came in, Sarah did things differently. Now the owner is coming back, reinstate. That's the term reappearance. Reinstate the normal routine. The normal routine, we call it speedy recovery. Speedy recovery is the reappearance of response which seems to have been switched off. Now it is switched on. Moving on, higher order conditioning. Higher order conditioning means that conditioning goes on and more step further than the original conditioning. This is an interesting one. I've been mentioning it, but I didn't say it's a high order thinking. Higher order learning. Higher order conditioning means that the conditioning goes one or more steps further than the original conditioning. Again, let's continue with the dog example. Before you dish out food, you whistle, you ring the bell. But not only does the dog associate food with the bell or your whistle. Instead, the dog associates food with other things, other additional things, the ones that I've been mentioning. Number one, you ring the bell, then they listen attentively, or they go towards that gate. They go towards that gate, they know we'll open that gate to bring them food. They play around in that gate. Chances are they will hear the smell because they are attentive. They hear the smell, that is number two. They say one step or more. Step number one, the bell rings. Two, they hear you carrying food. Just imagine you come and collect the dish, you open the package of food, you pour the food in the dish. That sound, they can associate that sound. So that is number three. Number four, the footsteps. You're walking towards the gate. They can't see you, but you're walking towards the gate, carrying the food. They can associate. They get excited. Three, they hear the dialogue. That's an association. They say higher order conditioning means that conditioning goes one or more steps. So step number one, we see step number two, they hear the food package when you pour the food. Step number three, footsteps. You can associate with so many things. Maybe calling them with their names. You do what? You pick up the dish. As soon as you pick up the dish, they know. That is higher order conditioning. It's more than just a bell. That makes the dog to get excited. It's more than that gets the dog to salivate. When you apply this again in human, higher order conditioning means that conditioning goes one step or more. When you apply this in human, let's assume that you are a primary school teacher. When your learner gets 75%, you put a sticker next to the marks. But tomorrow you decide to add something, you add a sweet. You tell them, once you pass with 60% to get 1 sweet, with pass with 7 to get 2 sweets. Meaning you're moving more step further, you add in. If it happens that you pass all your tests within the semester, you get a chocolate. That is higher order conditioning, means that conditioning goes 1 step or more. Let's continue. Stimulus generalization. Stimulus generalization refers to the tendency to respond to similar but not identical stimulus. Stimulus generalization refers to the tendency to respond to similar but not identical stimulus. For instance, when your friends call you, yeah, you beep beep outside the gate. You're expecting someone 8 o'clock, and he or she told you that, as soon as I'm there, I will put. You're expecting what? The sound. Beep beep. Suddenly, someone comes and does the beep beep. You go out only to find that it's not the person you're expecting. They're not coming to see you. Perhaps the hooters around the corner, the neighbor. They're collecting the neighbor, not you. That is, stimulus generalizations refer to the tendency to respond to similar but not identical. The dogs are used to the bell. However, now the bell is ringing next door. Not by the owner of the dog, the bell is ringing next door. That is stimulus generalization, the tendency to respond to similar but not identical. Because they learn by association. A bell means food to them. So if you pass and ring the bell, it triggers food. When you whistle, it triggers that food is coming. Here, let's assume that you were recently robbed and shots were fired. Suddenly, you pass a certain place, shots are fired. Because of the trauma, you run away or you experience further trauma. That is stimulus generalization, a tendency to respond to similar but not identical. Hope I'm clear. Then the stimulus discrimination. Stimulus discrimination means that the animals and person can discriminate and detect differences among similar stimulus and only respond to specific stimulus. This is an opposite of stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination means that the animal or a person can discriminate or detect differences among stimulus only respond to specific stimulus. I whistle. Or not whistle. This means you can discriminate, you can differentiate between your husband whistle compared to the neighbor's whistle. Perhaps when you ring the bell, when you give the dog food, you ring a bell twice, tinkling, tinkling. They know that the bell rings twice, tinkling, tinkling. Suddenly, the bell rings 4 times, tinkling, 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 tinkling. The dogs automatically will notice that no, that's not what you are used to. We are used to the 2 beeps, not more than 2 beeps. When you whistle, they can differentiate. That's the owner whistle, that's the kid's whistle, that's the neighbor whistle. So they can discriminate between the sound. They can associate. That is what you know. This is what you don't know. Yes, they say stimulus discrimination means that the animal or person can discriminate or detect differences among the stimulus. When you shout, they can notice that Busito's voice is not Nadir's voice. That Sarah's voice is not Kiabetu's voice. They discriminate mostly the sound effects. Even the footsteps, the dog can differentiate the footsteps. When I'm walking towards the dog, they know, oh, this is the owner, this is not an owner. So they are used to that. That's their strength. They learn through senses because they can't talk. Okay, let's continue. We're doing associative learning. We need to discuss cognitive and social. Let's move on. Okay, still under associative learning. So associative learning is divided into two. That's classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Let's see what is about operant conditioning. The learning that takes place depends on the consequences of a response that a person makes. Operant conditioning does not always involve producing an action. It sometimes involves withholding an action and not responding at all. Operant conditioning explains most of our daily lives behavior. Operant conditioning explains most of our daily lives behavior. Okay, let's start afresh. Operant conditioning. The learning takes place depends on the consequences of the response that a person makes. What do they mean? Learning takes place depends on the consequences. Yes, there is what? Punishment, reinforcement, learning reinforcement. I tell the kids, don't do this. Suddenly they do it. Then I will withdraw from giving them sweets. Because I'm trying to what? To change their behavior. Unlike classical. Classical is unconditional, it is automatic. At times it's difficult to control it. You do it unwillingly, you do it without our knowledge. Whereas operant conditioning, we do it purposefully most of the time. As they say, the learning that takes place depends on the consequences. If you know that if you do something wrong, you'll be punished. If you do something good, you'll be awarded. That is operant condition. Operant condition, the learning that takes place depends on the consequences of response that takes place. Operant condition does not always involve producing an action. It sometimes involves withholding an action and not responding. Chances are because you know that's not a good thing to do. Operant condition explain most of our everyday behavior. So these are principles of operant condition. Let's go through the principles of operant condition, then we'll understand what do they mean by the everyday behavior producing an action, the consequence. One, we have what? Positive reinforcement occurs when pleasant, desirable reinforcer follows a response. The kid does something good, does something acceptable, you award the kid. That is positive reinforcement. It's positive reinforcement. The negative reinforcement, which is an opposite, they say, occurs when pleasant and desired reinforcer does not follow a response. Occurs when pleasant and desired reinforcer does not follow a response. You have told the kids that if they produce a good behavior, or you have informed your employer that if you increase your performance, you'll get a raise. Suddenly, they produce that good performance, suddenly you don't give them a raise. That is negative reinforcement. The kids produce good marks, then suddenly you don't award them with their sweet or the star. That is a negative reinforcement, meaning it's an opposite of this. Then we have what? Punishment. Punishment refers to unpleasant consequence of the response. Punishment refers to unpleasant consequence. of the response. It depends on how you do it. You tell them, if you don't do 1, 2, 3, you'll be punished. Punishment as a school teacher depends. I'll put you in the naughty corner. I'll remove you away from the class. You have to get a short break. That's the form of punishment to make sure that you deal with what unpleasant when you do something wrong. That's a difference. So there's a difference between negative reinforcement and punishment. Don't confuse the two. Negative reinforcement occurs when pleasant and desired response does not follow a response. You share a pleasant. You promise someone that you award them for a good behavior. However, as soon as they have produced a good behavior, you don't respond them at all. Hence, I was using the employees. You'll tell them to perform to the best of their ability. They'll get a raise or some form of incentives. Then we don't give them those incentives as promised. That is a negative reinforcement. They produce a good behavior, but you don't award them. Compared to punishment, punishment is something different. Punishment is referred to unpleasant. You see, pleasant, unpleasant. Punishment, when you do something that is not acceptable, you get punished. By punish could be you give them a warning, or you cut their salary, or you suspend the employee. That is punishment. The learners don't produce the desired results, then you give them punishment. So punishment in this case is not about cheating the child, it's not about spanking the child. There are many mechanisms that you can apply to instill the good behavior or to show that that behavior you produce is uncalled for, is unpleasant. Then we have what? Partially reinforcement. Partially reinforcement means that reinforcement does not follow every person, only some are reinforced. Partial reinforcement means that reinforcement does not follow every person, only some are reinforced. You produce a good result, good grade, however, you only award the highest performer. You have all passed the assessment. All of you have passed the assessment, but the hours are given to certain people due to the criteria. You see? To tell employers to perform to their best of ability, then they'll get a trip to Dubai. They produce the good results, however, few people will go to Dubai. That is partially reinforcement. Moving on, we have fixed ratio schedule. Because it's multiple choice, make sure that you know these terms. Hence, I was emphasizing. Here they say pleasant, but response come. Pleasant, desirable, but response does not come. Punishment, unpleasant consequence. You highlight the keywords when you study. You differentiate keywords because it's multiple choice, it's tricky. Some concepts sounds the same, but they differ. And apparent conditioning, you see, the learning that takes place depends on the consequence. We know that is operant conditioning. That is not classical. Consequence has to do with operant. Operant conditioning does not always involve producing an action, whereas classical conditioning mostly produce an action. That's how it differs. Fixed ratio, we have fixed ratio, variable ratio schedule, fixed interval schedule, as well as variable interval schedule. Fixed, something that is fixed. Something that is rigid. Something that is, if 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, that is fixed. It cannot change. If they say do something in a fixed ratio, we know that 1 after comes 2, after 2 comes 3. is straight to the point. A fixed number of response must be made in order to obtain reinforcement. A fixed number of response must be made in order to obtain the reinforcement. Like I've said, you ring a bell twice, the dogs know that food is coming. Meaning it's a fixed ratio. They know that 1, 2, 3 equals to food. It's a fixed ratio. A fixed number of response must be made in order to obtain reinforcement. They tell you when you get 75, you will get awarded. That's it. Not 74, not 76. No, I'm making a mistake. Not anything that is less than 75. Only 75 upwards, you get reinforced. It's a fixed ratio. Then we have what variable ratio schedule. Variable ratio schedule, a number of responses that the rat must make before it is reinforced. A number of responses that the rat must make in order to be reinforced. Meaning, you need to do certain things in order to get reinforcement. Normally, when they train the animals, when they train the dogs, particularly dog trainers, to prepare them to work with officials, the cops, the policing departments. You normally see the videos. What they will do, someone will act like a criminal. The dog has been conditioned and has been taught that when you see a criminal, you need to chase the criminal. What do you bite? You only bite the hand. They don't bite the face. Mostly they bite the hand. They will condition, train to do that. Then the dog will learn that when I see the criminal, I chase the criminal, I bite the hand. Then what they do later, as soon as the dog does that, they give a dog something to eat or something to play with, meaning that's an award. They say, do 1, 2, 3, then you get this. The dog is conditioned to do it. Chase an animal, you get a bone. Chase an animal, you get something to eat. A number of responses that the rat make, here they use the rat as an example. The number of responses that the rat must make before it is reinforced. Dog training, dog games, they run around the yard. As soon as they reach a certain point, you give the dog something to eat. There's that thing they call a bone like. I'm not sure of the name. You take it, again, the dog runs, you give it. They're used to that. They get used to that routine. They say a number of responses that the rat must make before it is reinforced. Fixed interval schedule. Fixed interval schedule, a reinforcement that is produced for the first correct response after a certain amount of time has passed. A reinforcement that is produced for the first correct response after a certain amount of time has passed. Normally, these are games that we normally play. It could be when you watch those shows, game shows, they say you spin the wheel spins for a certain period, then you stop, then you get an award. A reinforcement that is produced for the first correct response after a certain amount of time. So we can associate it with the games. However, like I've said, if certain terms, certain sentences doesn't make sense to you, you highlight the keys. The key is under fixed interval schedule, say first correct response. You highlight first correct response. It's not a fixed number of response, but it's a first correct response. You highlight the key phrases. That's the difference between the two. It's fixed. But to me, it sounds the same. Perhaps you're studying. These two things to me sound the same. How do I differentiate them? I try to explain, but you don't understand. Why you do is that fixed ratio, fixed number of response, you highlight fixed number of response compared to fixed interval. Fixed interval is fact correct response after a certain time. That's how they differ. You highlight the key phrases, because when we create we design multiple choice questions, we also look at the key phrases. Variable interval schedule. The variable, there's a variable ratio schedule as variable interval. Again, we will check the difference between the two. They say produce a slow response that is strongly resistant to extinction. Here they say a number of responses that a rate makes. You see the difference here. The number of responses that a rate makes or person makes. The number of responses, then you get our rate. Here, produce a slow steady response. It's a steady response rate that is strongly resistant to extinction. Then you highlight. Especially now that exams are coming, we are studying more than 4 modules, 5 modules. It's a bit difficult to memorize or to understand everything in the textbook. You need to study smart. You study using certain techniques, certain memorization technique. You work with something that is good for you. Okay, we are done with operant conditioning. Let's move to cognitive learning. Number one, cognitive has to do with what? Your thinking, your reasoning process. Cognitive has to do with your thinking, your reasoning process. We have got cognitive maps. They say cognitive map. The way you think, your reasoning is part of cognitive. Whatever that I'm discussing here, you'll find in your learning unit. It's just that I've given you a summary here to give you a hint. What is it that in the relation with your study unit, your recommended book? One example of cognitive learning is our use of cognitive maps to represent environment in which we live. One example of cognitive learning is our use of cognitive map to represent the environment in which we live. A cognitive map is where? In your mind. A cognitive map is a mental representation of a spatial features of the area, a building, even the contents of the book. Cognitive map generally refer to a geographic area such as mental map of the routes you take or about to take. I come to you, I want directions to Gorib City. I want directions to the nearest police station. When you give me those directions, normally you pick up certain places, pick up certain objects. You say, you'll go straight, you'll pass the first robot. On your left-hand side, there's a clinic. You proceed. There's a firm, or there's a liquor shop. We think what? We think mental representation. We think through pictures. That is mental representation. Other forms of, if some form of learning are cognitive. Hence, we have what? Auditory learners, those learners who prefer to listen. As I'm teaching you right now, that it's easy for them to memorize information because they can hear my voice. There's those learners who are visual learners. When I create slides, they need colors. I highlight points using my highlighter. That's how they study. So differ. However, all of us, they use what? A cognitive map, imagination. So it's cognitive map followed by perceptual motor skills. Perceptual motor skills, one form of cognitive learning is seen in the acquisition of perceptual motor or sensory motor skills. Perceptual motor skills are formed on motor movement that are guided by perception. Perceptual motor skills are based on motor movement that are guided by perception. For example, professional tennis players have high developed perceptual motor skills. Their action on the tennis court depends on accurate perception of what other players are doing. Okay, let me stop here and explain this. Perceptual motor skills. Perception and motor. Remember motor? Motor is how you move your body. Is motor how you use your body. When you walk, motor skills. When you eat, is motor skills. When you blink, motor skills. You sing, there's motor skills. How you use your tendons, your joints, your muscle, that is motor skills. Then there's perception. Perception, of which you mostly use using your mind. They're giving us an example here. They say, for instance, tennis players. Have you seen how tennis players move? Left, right, they hit when they're hitting the tennis. Their movement is so quick, swift. They don't just look at the ball, the tennis ball. However, they also apply their senses by analyzing the body of the opponent. They know that the ball, when you step with your left foot, chances are that the ball will move from the right. When you step with your right foot, chances are the ball will move from the left. It's like soccer. When playing soccer, it's time to take penalties. The goalkeepers, they are taught how to analyze the body movement of the person who's about to hit the ball. That is perceptual and motor skills. They learn that. Perceptual, motor skill, that is a form of learning. If you learn by through cognitive, perceptual motor skills, then intellectual skills. Intellectual skills are learned and we never stop learning. True. Remember, learning is formally and learning is informally. Formal learning is a type of a learning that you acquire through schooling. Primary school, high school, university is a formal learning. Why formal learning? Because you are also you assess you and you get a certificate. That is formal learning. You need to be awarded with a certificate, a proof that you're competent for doing this. Then informal learning is what you learn from our parents, friends, also through our mistakes. That is informal learning, because we don't get awarded to do that. We don't get certificates. We learn by associating one thing with another, by discriminating between different things. We form concepts to represent things. We learn rules from using concepts to think and reason. On highest level, we can think about our own thinking. Yes, we can even think about our own thinking. That is reflection. We assess our own thinking, whether right or wrong. And the last one, which is social learning. Social learning, I will just summarize because some words are not clear, but it's much easier compared to the last three. Compared to classical and cognitive, this is the easiest type of learning. The first, social learning, social is through interaction. Social learning refers to the way we learn through interacting with other people. The way we learn through interaction with other people, it illustrates the fact that not all learning is formal, but also happens informally. That is social learning. You have friends, you have a family. Now, when again you talk, you hang around with one another. That is social learning. You learn that you don't have to shout to when you speak to someone. That is social. You learn that at times you need to be aggressive when you're addressing certain points. That's social. You learn that you need to be calm. You learn that you laugh, you show facial expression, social learning. No one taught you that, but you learn through interacting with other people. They say one way in which social learning takes place is through operant social learning. Many parents and teachers use operant social learning to encourage good behavior in children. So remember, operant is the one with punishment, positive reinforcement, and negative reinforcement. They say parents and teachers use operant social learning to encourage good behavior in children. For example, the young children may be given tasks at school or encourage what their efforts. In other words, we learn social acceptable and desired behavior being rewarded for appropriate behavior. You're being punished for bad behavior. For example, getting a fine for speeding, getting a speeding ticket is a form of learning and apparent that you don't need to do that. That is social learning. Social learning is we can associate social learning with observational learning, that we learn through seeing. When you see someone get away with something that is bad, chances are you do it yourself. But when you see someone being awarded for good behavior, chances are that I will apply that good behavior as well. So we learn by what? By seeing, by associating what is good behavior and what is unpleasant behavior. Then there's under social and observational learning. There's what? There's a theorist, Albert Bandura. That a behaviorist theorist, Albert Bandura, says, for us to understand observational learning, we need to focus on these 4 points: attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. Attention, we must pay attention to the model's behavior and the consequences of that behavior. When we interact, for instance, kids, they say kids learn what they live. When they see you doing something, they are likely to imitate it because you are doing it. They can't differentiate between what is wrong or right. Hence, when you watch TV, there's parental guidance. So they pay attention to what gives them pleasure. Hence, you need to be careful what you do in front of kids. They say you pay attention to the models of behavior and the consequences. However, as soon as you are mature enough, you have learned that as well as a kid. Now that you can differentiate between what's wrong and right, you choose which behavior to portray and what behavior not to portray. You know that there are consequences when you do something that's not acceptable. Retention. Another word for retention is keeping and saving. You must save a mental representation of what you have observed in order to be able to see it later stage. We learn through pictures. You imagine, if I ask you something, normally keep quiet. Why do you keep quiet? You try to you go to your stored memory to take out the information. You imagine it. As soon as you imagine, that is retention. You need to reproduce. Reproduction. You must be able to reproduce the observed behavior that is stored in the memory. As soon as you tell me the answer, meaning you are reproducing what you have learned. You are showing me that you did understood what you have learned. Then the last one is motivation. You will only reproduce behavior that you have observed if I'm motivated to do so. Motivation has to do with, as much as we go around the world, we meet people, we study, not only information is important to us, we pay attention to what has meaning to us. Like now, we are studying, that's where you focus, your focus is. You're trying to make sure that you understand these terms. You might find that you master human nervous system, you master the terms like intelligence. However, your challenge is social learning. So as soon as we say we're discussing social learning, you pay attention because you know that's your challenge. However, when I mention things like intelligence, you feel like, no, I know intelligence. That's not my problem. I'm studying for exam. I need to focus on what has the meaning to me. That's when they say you will only reproduce behavior that you have observed if you are motivated to do so. You are only motivated to retrieve what is important to us. That's it. Okay, guys, that is for today regarding learning.